Welcome to another exciting chapter of Sussing It Out. I, of course, am the Suss Man, Rick Sussman. That, of course, is the Joker face. Well, he's in there, just trust me. This, of course, is the Fortress of Nerditude. Made extra nerdy by me wearing my That Guy outfit. I am that guy wearing a jersey of the team that he so awesomely represents, though he does not play for. This is a Brett Favre jersey of the Minnesota Football Vikings for a solid season, at any rate. I am going to explain to you guys two things in this vlog. One, where my love of football comes from, and two, where my interest in fantasy football and how fantasy football kind of works. I'm going to make it quick, because I realize this is not exactly a topic of discussion for a great many people, but there are some friends of mine out there who are really excited about the concept of me explaining fantasy football. So here we go. Back in 7th grade, I had two very close friends of mine. I know, amazing that I had two friends. Moving on. And one of which was a really big Detroit Lions fan. He was actually a big Barry Sanders fan. Barry Sanders playing for the Detroit Lions. My other friend was an Oakland Raiders fan. Just big Oakland Raiders fan. He said he loved the logo. At any rate, I knew nothing of football at the time. I only knew college football. My dad went to Syracuse University, so I followed Syracuse University football. When I was growing up, Syracuse University football wasn't actually a joke. They had a real school. One of the wide receivers who played when I was younger was a wide receiver named Quadri Ishmael. The only thing I knew in 7th grade was that Quadri Ishmael had recently been drafted by the Minnesota Vikings. So I told my friends, well, I like Syracuse. They drafted Quadri Ishmael, who was my favorite player at Syracuse. Ergo, I am a Minnesota Vikings fan. So now you know that I'm a Vikings fan and why I'm a Vikings fan, though I was from West Palm Beach, lived in Florida my whole life, and has never actually set foot in the state of Minnesota. Moving right along. Why do I like fantasy football? Well, as we've mentioned a few times, I am a spork. I love sports. I love nerdy stuff. I'm a sports dork. I'm a spork. There is nothing, I don't care what anyone says, that is nerdier than fantasy football when it comes to professional sports and nerds and the combinations therein. The reason for that is fantasy football combines all of the interesting things about sports, like watching it, and all of the stat keeping that nerds like myself thrive ourselves on. All of these boxes of comics back here, though some are not actually in order right now, will eventually be alphabetized in reverse numerical. I even have a nerdy way in which I put the comics into their sleeves to make sure that they are nice and protected. I am very meticulous. Some may say I have an OCD. Some might be right. So, following stats and tracking stats is a big part of why I love fantasy football. So what is fantasy football? You join a fantasy football league as a single individual, and depending on what league you're in, you then draft your players. Every player is available, all the players in the NFL, even some who don't have a team, i.e. Tim Tebow. Perhaps mentioning his name will get me more vlog viewers. At any rate, every player who's in the NFL is available. Usually the first pick is the guy who is most likely to have the best year. That does not always mean it's the guy who had the best year last year, though they do tend to correlate. For the past few years, the best player to pick has been my personal favorite, and that is Adrian Peterson of course, the Minnesota Football Vikings. He is a running back. Running backs are in high demand in fantasy football because you receive points for however many yards a particular player gains, if they score a touchdown, and if they catch any balls. Basically, if they run really well and if they score a lot of points, you also score. Great example. In most leagues, every 10 yards that a player gains, they gain 1 point, and if they gain a touchdown, they gain 6 points. So a really easy way to explain it would be Adrian Peterson gets the handoff, he gets it at the 20-yard line, he then runs it in 20 yards and scores a touchdown. So he gets 10 points for each 10-yard, or 1 point for each 10-yard gained. So he gets 2 points for running 20 yards, and he gains 6 points for scoring a touchdown. There you go, 8 points. Now, you're not the only one in the league. Most leagues are 10 or 12 people deep, and you go up against other teams. So it's all like, it's basically an all-star team versus an all-star team, and you're trying to figure out which players are going to have the best games that day. Now, just because you have the best players doesn't necessarily mean that you want to start them. You have a bench, just like any other professional sport. Maybe your best player isn't going up against the worst defense, but one of your good players is going up against the worst defense, so it is likely to believe that though the player that you start isn't the highest rated, they might have the best game. If you really want to get in depth on this, there are thousands, probably millions of articles that you can read about fantasy football. But that's all secondary. I don't really play for money. Lots of people do. I play for the giggles. But more importantly, I play because it gives me a reason to watch absolutely every single football game I can on Sundays. Granted, I do work most Sundays, so that's usually just one game when I get home, but still, it gives me a reason to cheer for a team. If I'm ever at a sporting event, like a sports bar, for instance, this Thursday that just passed, there was the first game of the season. It was the Broncos against the Ravens. In my fantasy league, I have two of the Broncos wide receivers. I have Wes Welker, and I think his name is Demarius. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Thomas, he's a wide receiver as well. D. Thomas, wide receiver for the Broncos. Wes and D had awesome games. They both racked up somewhere in the neighborhood of like 100 yards, so 10 points, and both had like 2 touchdowns, so another 12. So both players combined for about 20 points apiece for me. And that's just 2 of my players. I've got like 6 more to go. So I could easily wind up with like 150 points, which would be great, because right now my opponent has 0 points. Granted, none of his players have played yet, so this Sunday will be very telling. So what fantasy football does for me is it, A, gives me a reason to watch every game. I really point to my fingers entirely too much. A, it gives me a reason to watch every game. B, it gives me someone to cheer for. I love football. I love watching football. I played it very briefly before the lights went out. Before everything on my right leg, the lights are back on, broke 1,000,000%. But I loved the game, and even though I got injured because of it, it gave me a bigger appreciation for the players, and I just cannot get enough of the game. I'm paused my, I think I'm watching Oklahoma versus West Virginia right now on Fox, and I'm watching that because it's football, and I miss watching football. If there's one thing I regret most about not having a regular job, is that since my Saturday and Sunday is everybody else's Wednesday and Thursday, I very rarely get to watch Sunday football. And that is too bad, but then again, we've been over this before. When you work at a comic book store for a living, life tends to be pretty good overall. So, that's it. That's the entirety of why I love fantasy football. It gives me something to watch every game. It gives me a reason to watch every game, and it helps me build my love and appreciation for fantasy sports and sports in general. Interesting side note, I tried fantasy basketball and fantasy baseball, and I hated it. So I think fantasy football might just be it for me. I hope you enjoyed watching Chapter 19 of Sussing It Out with the Suss Man, Rick Sussman. It was fantasy football. Chapter 20 might get a little political. We'll have to see how it's going. Stuff in Syria is getting a little weird, so I might comment on that, or I might just comment on comic books. Probably that second one. Talk to you guys real soon.